please help me welcome Mick. Mick Chantler.
Thank you for having me today. It's really quite a thrill to see such a nice turnout, and I appreciate all the kind words that Lynn and Judy and everyone else has made to me this morning. It's good to be back here at Oakmont. I've been at Oakmont many, many times before, and I will be back again in the spring if anybody's interested in baseball. We're going to be teaching a new course. I've taught a course on baseball here in the past, but this will be a different one, and therefore hopefully won't be repetitive even if you took the previous course. So today's topic is Reconstruction. Lynn has been asking me to teach an entire course on Reconstruction for years, really. I've been putting her off, but it's a possibility for the future because Reconstruction is a topic that merits our attention in a very serious way because it's not really over yet. The word Reconstruction, in its narrowest and most technical meaning, refers to the period in American history right after the conclusion of the Civil War. The Civil War ended in 1865, and the Reconstruction period, if you look in most standard history books, it will say Reconstruction lasted from 1865 until 1877, a 12-year period of time. More broadly, though, in recent years, historians have been lengthening the amount of time that we should consider Reconstruction to be the predominant theme in American history. It should go at least through the year 1900, because the work of reconstructing the country in the wake of the damage done by the Civil War took much, much longer than people realized at the time, or certainly that we realize today, I think. Then there's a third school of thought about Reconstruction that says it never really stopped. It went dormant for about 70 years, and then it came alive again during the 1950s and 60s with the rise of the civil rights movement. And so these historians who take the most generous view of the subject of Reconstruction feel that it really was a motivating force in American politics and culture up through at least the years of Lyndon Johnson in the 60s, because it was during his presidency that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, and then equally importantly, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which allowed African Americans to vote even in places like Mississippi and Alabama. Now, you could run a fourth definition, and if you want, and argue that even that didn't settle the issue entirely, because even today, there's controversy about African American voting rights in places like Georgia and Louisiana and so forth that are causing a great deal of turmoil in American political circles. We're still debating so many of the same issues that Americans were debating back in 1865, which is why I made that kind of somewhat pessimistic sounding statement to Lynn when she asked me to say summarize in one sentence perhaps why I find history so fascinating. Do we really learn anything from this, or do we just entertain ourselves by studying history? Well, I would say entertainment is a perfectly valid justification, and hopefully we do learn some things. So the first slide of the slideshow that we'll be using to help us move through our talk today is depicted on your screen there to the left. There we go. Nice big picture. This is a painting of William Tecumseh Sherman, the Union Army general, riding his horse along with his aides through the streets of Atlanta when Atlanta was burned to the ground in 1864. This was September, October of that year when finally Union Army forays into the rebellious southern states were reaching its apogee. It was the first 3 years of the war, Union Army fortunes were fluctuated between bad and awful. But by 1864, clearly the Union Army was going to win the war. And the way they won the war was fighting what Sherman called a hard war. The first 2, 3 years of the war, first 2 years particularly, President Lincoln and the military leaders of the Union Army felt that it was to the benefit of the nation to conduct the war with as little damage as possible. We are going to have to someday back together as Americans again and patch up the divisions that divided us and led us down this path to the abyss. If we're ever going to get over the divisiveness that caused the Civil War, Lincoln and his early generals felt, we need to minimize the damage done by the war. By 1863, Ulysses S. Grant and his subordinate, William T. Sherman, decided this isn't working. A soft war doesn't make any sense. The terms don't belong in the same sentence together. If you're going to fight a war, you have to go all in. And Sherman became, and Grant too, became the first practitioners in American history, at least, of what you would call total war. And that is, we're going to make the South howl for what they've done. That was Sherman's statement to President Lincoln in the fall of 1864 when he announced that he was going to take Atlanta, and if you knocked Atlanta out of the war by burning it, you destroyed the Southern rail infrastructure that allowed the Confederate armies to receive the foodstuffs from the Deep South that were feeding the armies in Virginia, the armies of Robert E. Lee that were carrying out the defense of the Confederate capital in Virginia. All of those armies subsisted on beef and grain that was imported from the Deep South. Georgia hadn't really been touched by the war until late 1864. And Sherman said, that's all over now. I'm going to burn whatever I have to in the state of Georgia. He writes a telegram to President Lincoln proposing that I march from Atlanta to the sea and destroy everything in my way. I can make this march, Sherman says to Lincoln, and I can make Georgia howl. And Lincoln said, do it. Do it. This is the quickest way to end this war. You might think it's heartless. It was cruel. If you read Gone with the Wind and you felt sympathetic with Scarlett O'Hara, you probably think that people like Sherman were the devil incarnate. But it was his thinking, it was Grant's thinking, and it was President Lincoln's thinking that the sooner we end this, the better. So, the first slide illustrates why we needed to have a period called Reconstruction, and that is the fantastic damage, physical damage done to the southern states, particularly in the last, say, 18 months or so of the war. It was devastating because it wasn't just Atlanta that was burned. When Sherman marches to the sea, he burns the plantations that are in his path. Then he takes Savannah, Georgia, on the ocean, and much, much more damage is done by the occupying Union forces there. Then he wheels his army north and strikes into South Carolina, where they burn the capital of South Carolina. The city of Columbia is destroyed. On and on it goes. Sherman's reason for causing such physical damage, which then necessitates a long period of reconstruction of the South, physical reconstruction, was in Sherman's mind. He said, this is the only way we're going to convince the Southern civilians to quit supporting the war effort. If they can continue to live their lives more or less normally, while Lee and his armies are doing all the fighting up in Virginia, this war could go on for 10 years. We can't survive a 10-year war. The nation will destroy itself in the process. We have to wrap this thing up and end it quickly. And so that was his rationale for conducting such a dreadful war of destruction. I title this side Dixie Apocalypse because if you look at this photograph taken at the very end of the war of Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, you can see it looks kind of like what Berlin probably looked like at the end of World War II, utter devastation. Uh, and if the cities are being destroyed in a way that rivals World War II destruction in some ways, you can only imagine the damage done to the Southern economy in the process, because Sherman and the advancing Union armies destroyed not only the urban population centers, but tore up all the railroad tracks, destroyed the bridges that went over the rivers in the South, uh, destroyed all the Southern locomotives and rolling stock that they could get their hands on. It was all out war, essentially. And what that meant was when the shooting finally did end in April of 1865, the nation was faced with an enormous task of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. How are we going to be a reunified nation with scenes like this in half the country? So that's one reason why Reconstruction uh, settled in the minds of the victorious Northern politicians. How are we going to put the country back on track again? How are we going to rebuild cities? How are we going to rebuild that transportation infrastructure that was destroyed in the South? But equally important to repairing the physical damage that was done, you had to figure out, what are we going to do with these people? The 4.2 million slaves that lived in the South, that picked the cotton and the tobacco and the rice and everything else that made the Southern economic system work prior to the Civil War. That's all over now. With the destruction of the Confederate government, President Lincoln was able to ram through the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. If you saw Spielberg's movie Lincoln, which I'd highly advise that you do, it's on Netflix and it's outstanding, with Daniel Day-Lewis playing the role of Abraham Lincoln. You see why it was so important for Lincoln to end the cause of this war, which was slavery. And the only way you could end it was with a constitutional amendment, because slavery was guaranteed in the original Constitution. So you got to change that. You have to amend the Constitution. How do you amend the Constitution? It's very, very difficult to amend. We'll probably never again see a constitutional amendment in our lifetime because it's so difficult. The reason Lincoln was able to get the Constitution amended is because all the Southern senators and congressmen were out. They had left the government when the war broke out in 1861. Therefore, the only people left in Washington, D.C. that could vote on a constitutional amendment were Northerners who supported Lincoln's war policy, mostly the Republicans. But if you watch that movie, you'll remember that Lincoln's people rounded up as many Democrats to vote for the amendment as possible. And with the ending of slavery, 4.2 million people hit the road. I mean, literally, they put down their hoes and their hammers and all the implements that they used to work during their slave years, and they start walking, sometimes in small groups of 5 or 10, other times groups of several hundred former slaves just start walking because they can no longer live on the plantations. They don't want to be there, first of all. And secondly, the plantation, Mazza, the owner of the plantation, is now out of business. He has nothing to sell anymore. So consequently, you have this massive population that's been uprooted and put into limbo. Because what are these people going to do? You see these pictures, the drawing on the right is from Harper's Magazine showing slaves, former slaves, just walking. Where are they going? In some cases, they really didn't know. They were trying to find probably the closest Union Army encampment where they could get food and some shelter and medical care. Other former slaves would walk from South Carolina to Texas. That's a long way because so many families during the slave years had been broken up and dispersed to the four winds because of the slave economy. There are documented cases, many of them, of where a 30-year-old mother in South Carolina would say, I'm going to Texas because I want to find my son. He was sold by Mazza to a Texas cotton planter, and I've got to go find him. So she's going to walk 1,000 miles to Texas. Well, where in Texas? Well, I don't know. I'll find out when I get there, but I'm going to find my boy. It's tragic. It's tragic. And there was no help for these people in the initial months after the Civil War. The Union Army was still had their hands full with trying to reimpose order on the vanquished southern states. These people, of course, were illiterate. They had no job skills other than agricultural skills. What are we going to do with all these people? Well, a broad swath of public opinion in the North, in the immediate wake of the war, said, we've got to help them. We can't just turn them loose onto the roads of the South and say, well, I guess we finished our work there, didn't we? Now we can go back to the real business of America, which is making money, developing the industrial system in the North, settling the West, out in Colorado and California and Utah and places beyond the Mississippi. No, no, many Northern congressmen said that would be an extreme betrayal of these African Americans. To just let them go and fend for themselves would be a horrible crime against humanity. We have to reconstruct the Southern economic system to provide a place for these people, and we have to lend them a helping hand. So that would have been the second goal of Reconstruction, was a kind of a thoroughgoing rebuilding of the Southern mindset to enable these people to survive and thrive. The hope was on the part of the so-called radicals. That was the name that was given to the Republicans in Congress who wanted to go all in on helping the former slaves. By the way, the radicals never represented a majority of public opinion at that time in the North. They represented a well-organized minority, but it was never the majority. So their thinking is we've got to set up government-funded institutions to help these people. Something was brought into an organization was brought into existence in 1866 called the Freedmen's Bureau that provided for the Army, the U.S. Army, to provide food, medical supplies, basic shelter for these millions of displaced Southern blacks. Um, it also set up educational institutions. Young white women from the North, in many cases 19, 20-year-old college students from colleges in Vermont and Massachusetts who had a sense of social justice and a feeling that now my brothers, my father, my neighbors all fought so hard to end this evil of slavery. Now it's my job as a 20-year-old young woman to go down to the South and work in a school to provide some survival skills for these people, to teach them how to read and write and do basic arithmetical computations so they can get on in the world. I mean, if these people are left to fend completely for themselves, what are they going to do? I mean, the only thing they know how to do is the most rudimentary agricultural chores. So the Freedmen's Bureau sets up a number of procedures to provide educational opportunities for the blacks. It also provides them with a legal mechanism whereby they can try to locate their displaced relatives, children, and so forth, so that some poor woman in South Carolina doesn't have to walk to Texas looking for her son. Texas is a pretty big place to start looking at random for a son that maybe she hadn't seen for 10 years. So the Freedmen's Bureau set up a mechanism whereby government agents would try to identify slaves and reunite them with their families. So a number of efforts were undertaken to ease the transition from slavery to freedom for these people. It was never enough, and it was not sufficiently funded. Even at the height of the Freedmen's Bureau, there were only around 1,000 federally funded agents working on this in the South. That was hopelessly inadequate to the task. But it was at least an attempt at, again, reconstruction of the Southern system that had been so completely smashed in 1863, 64, and 65. Here we see more pictures, which are quite heartrending if you look at them a minute. The photograph on the left shows two brothers, slaves, obviously, had been slaves until the end of the war. And now there they are, barefoot, ragged clothes. Who knows if they have a mother? Probably don't have a father anywhere around because he's probably been sold down the river to a Mississippi planter. So now these two young guys are on their own. You just can't leave them in a state of uncertainty and vulnerability like that. Here on the right, you see a photograph of all the slaves on a plantation. You can imagine the anxiety that must be going through these people's minds. Okay, we're no longer slaves, but what are we? Are we really free? Do we have any way of getting on in the world? Well, not until the Northern government does something to reconstruct Southern society. Adding to the problems that not only the freedmen but the white Southerners faced, since they were on the losing end of the war, was a deep-seated sense of bitterness on the part of the Southern whites who had lost the war. You might say Southerners were defeated on the battlefield in 1864 and 65, but they weren't defeated in their minds. They were still absolutely convinced of the righteousness of their cause, the justice of secession from the Union, and their willingness to fight a 4-year war that costs the nation a total of around 650,000 dead. I mean, unbelievable cost in blood and treasure on both sides. And when you lose a war like that, typically or often what happens is people just can't believe it. It's a state of shock. And Southern whites felt, how could we have lost? God was on our side. Justice was on our side. Well, the only reason that we lost was because essentially the Yankees cheated. What I mean by that is a myth grew up after the war called the lost cause syndrome. And in the lost cause thinking, the idea was promulgated throughout the South that, well, yeah, we lost, but it was only because the Yankees had bigger armies than we did and more implements of destruction because they had more money. But that wasn't fair. I mean, really, we were the moral victors in this war. Wait, you lost because the other side had more guys than we do? Isn't that the way wars are decided? I mean, as they often say, God is on the side that has the biggest battalions. And I think that's was true in the case of the Civil War. So in the weeks right after the ending of the shooting in 1864, there was a victory celebration on the part of the victorious Union forces. And the victory celebration took place on the island of Fort Sumter, which is where the war began 4 years earlier in April of 1861, when the rebels fired on the Union garrison at Fort Sumter. It's in an island right off of Charleston. It's just in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. And at this victory celebration, there were prominent Northern abolitionists, people that had been deeply opposed to slavery for over a generation, to come and deliver the keynote speeches. There were Union Army officers. There were 3,000 former slaves that were ferried across the water from Charleston to Fort Sumter to take part in the raising of Old Glory again, because when the war started, the commanding officer, Union officer of the garrison on Sumter, had to lower the flag. Well, now that same officer who survived the war, Robert Anderson was his name, was present at the re-raising of the American flag. And all the former slaves, who are now freedmen, as they were called, applaud with wild enthusiasm. One of the speakers at the ceremonies was the son of a man named Denmark Vesey. Denmark Vesey is a name that probably is lost to history for most of us, but he was a man who led a slave uprising against the slave owners in South Carolina back in the early 1820s. There are Northern preachers, people like this man, Henry Ward Beecher, who's the brother, by the way, of Harriet Beecher. And that name might ring a bell. She wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which many people feel. Lincoln once jokingly said when he met her, he said, "So you're the little lady that started this great big war." Because her work was such a powerful piece of what you might call anti-slavery propaganda, that it galvanized Northern anti-slavery opinion to the point where they were willing to go to war to finally confront the Southerners with this dreadful evil. And people like Henry Ward Beecher, who is, by the way, probably the most prominent preacher in America in his day. As you can see, he's not in a forgiving mood. As he said, Southern leaders will be whirled aloft and plunged downward forever and forever in endless retribution. That was a strong, strong sentiment in the North in the months right after the Civil War, for understandable reasons. Practically every family in the North had lost somebody in the war, a son, a cousin, a brother, a father. The anger was palpable. Now, now Lincoln is dead, sadly. He's killed 5 days after the war ends. But if Lincoln had been around during this celebration, which takes place about 2 or 3 weeks after he died, he would have listened to this and he said, "No, no, that's not what we want. We don't want endless retribution. That's just a formula to keep us all hating each other and probably will lead to a second civil war within a generation. This can't be. We have to come back together and somehow tie up the wounds, the psychological wounds that have separated us." But I'm afraid Beecher's position was pretty common at that time. Now, I want to just for a moment go back to this scene. If you're a white Southerner, let's suppose you had been a slaveholder. Let's suppose you had been a prominent person in the city of Charleston, which was the hotbed of secession in the years leading up to the Civil War. And you're looking across the water and you're seeing 3,000 former slaves going and praising the United States, the raising of the United States flag and applauding it. And you're hearing talk from a man like Henry Ward Beecher saying, "You guys are going to pay for what you did. You're not getting off easy. We're going to make you account for your sins of almost destroying this beautiful nation of ours." What do you think the white Southerners are feeling as they watch a demonstration like this? They are not happy. They feel those damn Yankees, they're rubbing our nose in the dirt, in the muck, because they were able to win. Well, we're not going to let them get away with it either. So even though the war ended, it wasn't like the animosity ended. As a matter of fact, Appomattox was the courthouse in Virginia where Robert E. Lee surrenders his army. This is a famous painting showing Ulysses S. Grant accepting the surrender from Robert E. Lee, which effectively ends the war. There's some sporadic fighting that goes on after that, but essentially the war is over. I think it was April 9th, 1865. And many historians, the passage from the top there comes from the fellow that's in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, a man named Robert Penn Warren, very important writer during the 1930s, 40s period. He made the assertion, and I think he was right, that even though the South was defeated in the war, the defeat actually made the South the South. And what he meant by that was Southerners had a way of life. They had an outlook on the world which differed considerably from their northern countrymen in the years before the Civil War. But they didn't think of themselves as Southerners per se. What they thought of themselves was Alabamans or Mississippians, or I'm a Louisianan, or I'm a Texan. But there wasn't really a sense of Southern nationalism that we are a unit here below the Mason-Dixon line, and we have our own unique beliefs, outlooks, and a unique form of our religious faith that welds us together as a people. That sense of unity and Southern nationalism really happens only in defeat. Isn't that interesting? And because it happens only as a result of defeat, Southerners feel they have to bond together now to resist Yankee domination. After all, the devil's in town. How are we going to effectively stand up against him unless we all bury our differences and hang together as Southerners? And one way you do that is you start concocting myths in your mind. And one of those myths was this idea of the lost cause, that the only reason we lost the war is because the Yankees had the bigger battalions. Actually, there were lots of reasons why the South lost the war, but it's easier to have one focal point to focus your energy on. So Southern leaders are bent but not bowed. They're not really accepting defeat. Yeah, we know we lost the war on the battlefield, but that doesn't mean we've lost it in our hearts and in our minds, and more importantly, deep in the heart or in the pit of this Southern soul. And so you had people like this man, his name was Toombs, who vows, and he's far from alone. I only put his face up there as an example of the kind of sense of rancor, deep-seated hostility, and rage toward the North for defeating the South. He's not at all an unusual figure. And there's a photograph on the left there that I put up because it illustrates Toombs and, by extension, so much of the White South's feeling toward the Northerners. In 1873, you might recall there was a huge fire that almost burned down the city of Chicago. I mean, cities burned in those days. I mean, they were all made out of wood, so if a fire started anywhere, the fire would burn. And Southerners learned that this fire was going on via the telegraph, which kind of allowed for news to spread rapidly for the first time in human history, really. The telegraph didn't come online until the 1840s. But now in 1873, when the Chicago fire is burning, Southerners could follow the news. And Toombs goes down to the telegraph office every 2 or 3 hours to check on the progress of the fire. And somebody, this is in South Carolina, somebody asks him, "What's the news from the fire?" And his response was kind of a typical Southerner's response. He said, well, it seems like they're doing everything they can to put the fire out, and they've got it contained in some parts of the city. But there's some good news, and that is the wind is on our side. He wanted to see Chicago burned because that would have been, in a sense, just revenge by God against the hated Yankees for burning all the southern cities during the last years of the war. Much of the post-war period was marked by extreme hostility on the part of the defeated whites in the South. One of the ways they manifested their rage was to desecrate Union Army graves that were all throughout the South. I mean, when a battle was fought during the Civil War, there would be thousands of bodies stacked up afterward. And in those days, they didn't have the capacity to, ship them back to their homes in Indiana or Massachusetts. So the dead Union soldiers were buried usually right on the spot where they had been killed after the battle was over. And tombstones were put up, but all throughout the South in the late 1860s, Southern Red Hots destroyed the tombstones and would desecrate the graves in any way they could. The picture of the woman on the upper left-hand corner of your screen there is a woman named Drew Faust. She was the president a few years ago of Harvard University. I think she was the first female president of Harvard, and she had written a book based on her doctoral dissertation on this subject of Reconstruction, and she focused a lot on the destruction of the graves in the South after the war. It seems like a relatively minor point to focus a whole book on, but actually it's revelatory, I think, because it shows how deeply angry Southerners were that you would break up graves and destroy the tombstones of dead soldiers shows just how enraged they were, especially when you consider that these same Southerners were probably good Christians that were doing that. I mean, the South was a very religiously oriented society, and for them to do that shows the depth of hostility in their hearts. So how do you show hostility if your army has been absolutely crushed? Well, you do what Hezbollah does or Hamas does. You develop a terrorist organization because terrorists can be very, very effective in the short run, at least. And it's very difficult, as Israel is finding out today, to eradicate a terrorist movement if it has the support of the civilian population. So Southerners did essentially what's going on in Lebanon and Gaza, and that is they form the Ku Klux Klan or the Knights of the White Camellia, or several other organizations that were devoted to terrorizing to the extent that they were capable of carrying it out, acts of revenge against the occupying Yankee army that took over the South after the war was over. But that was pretty dangerous. I mean, a bunch of guys in white hoods attacking an army base, they don't stand much of a chance. So what do you do instead? You shoot black people in their homes because that's safer to do. You can get away with it. So here we see a Ku Klux Klansman opening the door to a southern cabin inhabited by black people and carrying out acts of violence against the inhabitants or the owners of the home. This kind of thing sweeps through the South. The Ku Klux Klan becomes a major threat to the stability of Southern society. And actually, there is no stability in these years. And it's such a threat that President Grant becomes the president after he's elected in 1868 based on his stellar Civil War record. And he gets Congress to pass a bill called the Force Act, which enables Northern soldiers to arrest suspected members of the Ku Klux Klan, bring them to trial. He empowers the Department of Justice to issue arrest warrants against the members of the Klan, and he essentially, over about a 2 or 3 year period of time, he breaks the Ku Klux Klan. But it's a hard, long process because it's a secret organization. That was the purpose of wearing masks. The people that participated in the Klan obviously didn't want others to know their identity. And so they maintain an anonymity behind these masks and therefore avoid arrests. But a number of infiltrators are sort of secretly inserted into the Klan, and they provide enough intelligence information to the army officials such that the key Klan leaders could be arrested and prosecuted. And the Klan is shut down. But the problem with a terrorist organization is it's like trying to herd cats or something. I mean, Israel can wipe out hundreds, maybe thousands of Hezbollah fighters today, but next week there'll be more of them back. It's just the nature of trying to fight a terrorist organization. So these organizations, even though Grant was successful in breaking the back of the Ku Klux Klan for a while, others would turn up in their wake and continue the same policy of terrorism. I'm going into all of these details just to illustrate to you the importance of reconstructing Southern society. You not only had to fix the railroads and the cities that had been destroyed, you had to fix this, because how can you have a modern society, especially in a democracy, with people like that with guns running around? How can you conduct the economic development of the South in such a way that it can rejoin the nation and produce a stronger, more united, and more successful America? Northern businessmen were eager to spend money on Southern economic development. They felt this was a great opportunity. Northern bankers, investors, Wall Street financiers, and so forth had lots of money. The war, by the way, was a tremendous stimulus to the Northern economy because of all the industrializing that took place that was necessary to create the implements of destruction to win the war. So these Northern bankers come out of the war flush with cash. What's the best way to spend it? Well, rebuild the South. But how are you going to rebuild the South with this kind of nonsense going on? You can't. You have to have a reasonably stable society for people to want to invest in that society. So that was another reason why Reconstruction becomes such a top priority for the South. One of the attempts to reconstruct the South was undertaken by the Northern Congress when they passed the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which gave the freed slaves, now the freedmen as they were called, the right to vote. But if you're a white former Confederate Army officer, you don't want to see the guy that was picking cotton for you before the war voting. That would be an insult. Only white men should vote, and we're not going to let it happen. So even though the 15th Amendment, in theory and on paper, guaranteed Black people the right to vote, it was a very dangerous thing to do. And here we see an example. The Richmond Whig newspaper shows a slain Black man lying in the gutter, and the title of the drawing is "One Vote Less." So the terrorist movement in the South turned their sights on the Blacks that were attempting to vote. That creates another problem because Northerners want to resettle the South as quickly as possible. How do you do that? As long as you have this kind of boiling animosity against the people that you're attempting to help. If you're a radical from the Northern Congress, a man like this fellow, Thaddeus Stevens, who's one of the more interesting people to come out of this period. By the way, if you saw that movie Lincoln, you might remember the figure on the right of your screen there that played Thaddeus Stevens. Who is that? Anybody recognize him? Tommy Lee Jones, who did a stellar job of playing the role of the real Thaddeus Stevens, is on the left of your screen here. Thaddeus Stevens was the most progressive, forward-looking congressman of his day. He was a man that wanted to give the Southern blacks a fair shake. What he wanted, what he proposed, he didn't have the votes to make it happen, but he wanted the Northern, the Congress to pass legislation which would allow the government to seize the property of Southern slaveholders and break up the old plantations of the South and turn the lands over to the former slaves, and then provide them with the necessary implements to start their own little farms. It was Sherman's hope when he conquered Georgia to give every former slave 40 acres and a mule. That expression became kind of a password for this Northern radical idea that we can reconstruct the South along fairer lines by confiscating the property of the wealthy. But the votes weren't there, and that never happened. Nobody got 40 acres and a mule. But Stevens wouldn't give it up. Stevens was one of the main driving forces behind the 14th Amendment, which 13th Amendment ends slavery. 14th Amendment guarantees certain civil rights for the former slaves. Although Stevens wasn't satisfied with the 14th Amendment, he thought it was kind of weak with a lot of loopholes, and of course he was right. And the 15th Amendment, which Stevens supported reluctantly only because he thought it was too namby-pamby, it was too weak. It didn't really guarantee blacks the right to vote. And of course, even in those days, it was only black males that were given the right to vote under the 15th Amendment. So Stevens carries on the fight. He's going to die in the late 1860s. He's not in good health, but he's a fascinating figure. Those of you that are music fans might enjoy to know the little anecdote that Bob Dylan shared during an interview once many, many years ago, in which Bob Dylan said, "Stevens was my hero when I was young. I went to the Library of Congress, read all of his speeches, and that's what motivated me to become involved in the civil rights movement." And apparently, how many times does a cannonball fly and all that? What's the name of that song? Blown in the Wind, thank you, was based on his readings of Thaddeus Stevens's works in Congress. Stevens was a man who had a black mistress, which just, I mean, it was done in those days. He was far from the only one, but he was the only one that made no pretense about it. He hired a woman to be his housekeeper. He was a single man. Hired a black woman to be his housekeeper, and they wind up living together for years. He leaves in his will the plan to devote much of his money to establishing schools in the South that would be open to black children as well as white children. He wanted to establish a fund that would be in perpetuity guarantee the rights of young black children to get a decent education, seeing that as being really their only hope to advance in the world. He's a guy you might want to consider Googling at least and getting a little bit of background knowledge on. In the years, well, the months after the Civil War, it was so clear because of the ongoing violence by the terrorist organizations and the extreme dislocation of the black people that had been slaves that we couldn't just let the South now put the pieces back together again on their own. First of all, they weren't interested in developing a real just and fair system for all concerned. So Congress passed an act called the Military Reconstruction Act, in which the South was divided up into 5 military districts, and 5 Union armies patrolled in these military districts, as you see here on the screen. And this period of military reconstruction lasts for about 5 years and finally comes to a close in the early 1870s. President Lincoln had promised a new birth of freedom for Americans at Gettysburg when he delivers his immortal address there. And out of that comes the 14th Amendment, as I mentioned a moment ago, and the drawing at the bottom of the screen illustrating the right to vote, which was guaranteed, at least on paper, by the 15th Amendment. So there were reasons for optimism, but there's also a lot of reasons for despair, because you can pass all the laws you want, but if it doesn't reach the hearts of the people that it's aimed at, it's not going to be successful. And sadly, that's what we see. We're running out of time here a little bit, so I want to talk the last 5 minutes that we have here about why Reconstruction ended when it did, because the work was nowhere nearly done. It was just beginning. But by 1877, most Northerners had tired of the moral crusade. They had grown weary of the endless disruption. They had their belly full of violence. People wanted to get back to a normal life by 1877. And the thinking throughout the North was, okay, okay, we've done enough for African Americans. We ended slavery. We at least tried, in some cases, to put them on their, set them on their feet and give them a chance, at least, at a normal life. Granted, it wasn't sufficient. Our efforts fell far short of the mark, but we did what we could. And look what it got us. Endless assassinations, riots. I mean, throughout Reconstruction, there are these horrible race riots in southern cities in which the police stand by with their arms folded and little smiles on their faces as they watch whites burn down the black section of town and destroy black businesses. And the thinking is, we just can't keep on doing this. That was the general attitude that became pervasive in the North. And the feeling was, we've got to bring this to an end. And we'll close by describing the event that brought an end, a formal end, to the first Reconstruction period. And that was the election of 1876. It was a contested election. We think 2020 was contested. 1876 was really contested because there was voting in the southern states, but you can imagine how chaotic and corrupt the voting procedures were given this environment that I've been describing. And so you had a contested outcome with two states sending two different sets of electors to Washington to cast their votes for the candidates. And the Republican candidate was a man named Rutherford B. Hayes, excuse me, Hayes. The Democratic candidate was a man named Tilden. And Southerners wanted Tilden to win because the Democrats in those days were the pro-Southern party. It's just the opposite of what you think today. You can't look at the politics of that period and apply our present standards. The Republicans of the early 19, or this period at least, are not at all like today's Republicans, and the Democrats of that day are not like today's Democrats. So, with that caveat, the gridlock in Washington to settle this dispute, whose electors from these disputed southern states are we going to accept? It finally came down to a deal, old-fashioned political horse trading. Essentially, the Republicans offered the Democrats the deal. You give us the White House, let Hayes be the winner, and in exchange for that, we'll pull the last of the federal troops out of the South, and we will also tell the Justice Department, close your eyes and your ears to anything that you hear coming out of the South. It's not your problem. No longer are you to investigate an assassination of a black mayor in a Georgia town. No longer is it going to be your job to see that blacks in the South are allowed to vote. So we'll call it quits. Essentially, what the Northern government, what Congress did, was told the South, you run the South the way you want. Just don't give us any grief any longer. Just don't talk about starting a second civil war. As long as you behave yourself, you can do whatever you want. You have carte blanche to run Southern society the way you want. And of course, what you get is, and I'll close on this remark, the era of Jim Crow. And that's the South becomes a rigidly segregated society. More segregation in the 1880s and 1890s than you had in slave days. In slave days, African Americans and whites had to intermingle because they were just like that in the economic system. But starting in the 1880s and 90s, there's a rigid separation of the races, and that's going to last until the 1950s, 60s, maybe even more recently than that. So Reconstruction, in a sense, is an ongoing process. We're still not done with it, but at least we're miles ahead of where we were then. And I think even miles ahead of where we were in the 1950s and early 60s. So with that, we'll bring this to a conclusion. And Lynn says we've got a few minutes to take some questions, do we?
Oh, you bet we do.
Okay.
Thank you, Mick.
Thank you.
I just wish we had more time
Yeah.
today, but I'm looking forward to you teaching that lifelong learning course.
Yeah,
About
I mean,
this.
there's a lot to unpack in this.
I bet
Okay,
we have
so
questions
we've got microphones. You need to speak clearly into the microphone.
like so.
Okay,
Great talk. Every time you come here, I learn more and more.
well, thank you.
What happened in Reconstruction is happening now under Trump, where the white people are being scared that the brown people or the black people are going to take over, and they're eating your dogs and your chickens and your poodles and everybody else. I see this directly, not just in the South, but in the northern, non-educated college people are following all the garbage Trump's putting out there, all these lies.
And I draw the line at eating poodles myself. That's a non-starter for me. Oh yeah, you got a good point there. In the back.
Yes, I have two quick things. One is I want to mention Eric Larson's book. I'm sure you have it there. You have it there. Good. The Demons of Unrest, which
One
is
of the
about the
students,
start.
gave me this? This
Oh, yeah.
fine lady right here
Yeah,
gave me this.
the
Isn't
start
that
of the-
nice? I really appreciate that. Yeah.
And I want to mention one other thing. There's now a bill before Congress to set up the Rosenwald National Historic Site. Julius Rosenwald was the man who made Sears into a big corporation, and he helped build 5,400 schools in black areas of the 13 southern states from about 1880 to 1915. And this bill, if it passes, will set up a visitor center in Chicago, and then at least one school in each of the 13 southern states that were part of the Rosenwald group of 5,400.
Thank you. That's good knowledge. I'm not aware of that. Okay, you want to? Okay, right.
The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery,
The 13th did. That's correct.
with one exception.
What's that?
If you were convicted of a crime, you could be enslaved and your labor sold. Do you want to talk a little bit about the ways of convict farming
Oh,
that
I see.
shaped
Yeah, yeah.
our notion of crime?
Well, I don't know a great deal about that, but you're right. I mean, if you're convicted of a crime, you can be used for forced labor. Still, though, that's not exactly slavery. I mean, it's pretty close, I'll admit. But under slavery, a slave had absolutely zero rights, except for those that his owner chose voluntarily to grant that person. The only safeguard in law that a slave had was a slave owner could not kill a slave. But try getting a Southern court to indict or to convict someone who did kill one of their slaves. Anything else was fair play. So that's not true At least legally, it's not true of prisoners. But I hear what you're saying. In principle, it's, yeah. Question.
Uh, if you look at this and you think about maybe what you would want people to have done, why didn't more people immigrate to the North?
From the South, you mean? Northerners didn't want them. I think that's an excellent question. Many of us probably have the notion that Northern people were, because they were against slavery, they must have been very open-minded and sympathetic toward Black people. That wasn't true. The first half of the statement was, Northerners almost entirely opposed slavery. But the reason they opposed slavery was because it was a backwards, inefficient, outmoded economic system. But that didn't mean they wanted these 4.2 million Black people to come to the North and take their jobs and start marrying with white people in the North. I think the racism in the North, in some ways, was worse than that which you had in the South. Boston, a good point. Yeah, I mean, Ted Kennedy had to dodge tomatoes and rotten eggs that were being thrown at him when he was advocating for civil rights. And that's right. Yeah, Jackie Robinson couldn't get hired by the Red Sox, that sort of. I think I hope that answers your question. As far as I can see, Northerners, except for New England was kind of an exception. People in New England actually took their Christianity seriously, and they really believed what the Bible said. And they wanted to extend a helping hand as much as possible. But even that wasn't true, as Vic says. I mean, look at Boston and their record on race since then. But at least the intellectuals, the educated people of New England wanted to give Blacks a fair chance. And they would have, and in some cases did, welcome Blacks from the South to come to places in New England and work and live. But that was an exception. Most people, I'll give you, even Abraham Lincoln himself belonged to an organization called the American Colonization Society. The purpose of the American Colonization Society was, once we end slavery, let's put all the former slaves on ships and send them back to Africa, because we don't want them here. Abraham Lincoln belonged to this organization. So did James Madison. The list of noteworthy Americans who were members of this colonization society is a very long and impressive list of the best and brightest minds in America. The thinking that we could have a biracial society just wasn't there in the minds of most Americans, North or South, in those days. So I hope that's a short answer, at least, to your question. Yeah.
My name is Iris, and I just wanted to share that I was raised in Virginia and North Carolina. When I graduated from college, I got my first teaching job in the Ku Klux Klan area of Richmond, Virginia.
Mm.
I lived on a plantation that was on the James River, and I sneaked into a Ku Klux Klan meeting, and it scared the bejesus out of me. I wanted to see what was going on because I had to pass a Ku Klux Klan sign every day going to teach.
Is that right?
And
My
then
goodness.
I also received postcards in the mail with photos of Black men next to monkeys and trying to show from a PhD that they were definitely directly, like monkeys. I mean, it was just phenomenal. I wanted to say that today Virginia is a purple state because Black voters are active.
Right.
And also, I think true education is the only way to change this problem. And the reason I live in California is it's 3,000 miles from where I come from.
Good. Well said. Well said. And I think just one last comment on the Ku Klux Klan that might address his question too. The Ku Klux Klan experienced a major resurgence in the 1920s, and it lasted well into the 1960s. I mean, I know it still exists, but it's much smaller than it was at one time. Where was the Klan the largest? In the North. In the Indiana, somebody said. Who said that? Yeah, absolutely. I think it was Indiana where the Klan endorsed a guy for a governor's race, and that guy got elected. The Ku Klux Klan endorsed a man for high office, maybe governor, maybe senator, up in Oregon, of all places, and that guy got elected. So we can't blame the South for all of this bigotry and prejudice. It's pretty deeply spread. Sadly, it might be in our national DNA. I mean, I know that's a harsh judgment, and I don't want to conclude with that, but it does seem very difficult to eradicate, doesn't it? Another question.
Yes, my relative was Eli Whitney,
Oh,
and he invented the cotton gin.
that's right.
And I read somewhere that he was the cause of the Civil War
In a way.
because they brought more, they didn't have to pick the seeds out of the cotton. So the gin did that. So they brought more blacks in to grow more cotton. Cotton became king.
Exactly.
And they were trading with England at the time. And I don't know if that interfered with what the North, as far as monetary values, because they had mills up there and some of the cotton got shipped up to the North. And then I know when we lived back in the South, I noticed there was old mills around. And so I was wondering if that was one of the reasons, because of the trade with England and the North as far as the cotton and other commodities.
Well, yeah, cotton. Uh, there's a great book about cotton called The Empire of Cotton that was written maybe about 10 years ago. And it describes how central cotton was to the world's economy in the 19th century. This man that wrote the book said that cotton played the same role in the world economy of the 1800s that petroleum played in the 20th century. It was that vital. And you're absolutely right. Southern cotton became a rapid avenue to wealth after the development of the cotton gin that your ancestor developed, right? And who were the biggest consumers of Southern cotton? Well, England couldn't buy enough cotton. I mean, it had to have cotton not only from the South, but from Egypt and India and everywhere else they could buy, because cotton fueled the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. But it also did in New England, Lawrence, Massachusetts, and places like that. And Northern investors bought all the cotton they could from Southern growers, prompting, by the way, many of the abolitionist red hots in the years before the Civil War, the people that were utterly opposed to slavery, took to refusing to wearing cotton clothes. They would only wear wool or flaxen or something of that nature. They also would refuse to buy sugar and put sugar in their tea and coffee and so forth, because it was a way of showing their disdain for the Southern slave economy. Sugar coming from Louisiana and Mississippi and so on. Do we have time for?
Yes, this will be our final question.
Final question. Well, we
I
have
hate
to have.
cut it off, but we have to.
We have to have Vic have the final word then.
There's an old adage that all wars are ultimately economic.
Yeah, you can argue that. Well, thank you, everyone. I certainly appreciate it. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Mick. We want to remind you the lifelong learning. Hopefully we'll be sponsoring Mick again for more classes, or else we're going to push you into it, Mick.